I still don't understand why we chose to go there. It was meant to be a weekend escape where we could unwind and forget about our busy lives. But that cabin in the woods changed everything. My friend Mike discovered the location online and told us it was ideal, displaying images of the quaint little cabin encircled by trees. No self-service, no Wi-Fi. We packed our bags and drove out to the middle of nowhere, excited for a weekend of relaxation. The drive was long, and the farther we went, the more isolated the road became, with tall, dark trees lining it. At first, it seemed like a dream, just us in nature, where we could escape the constant noise of the city and enjoy some peace and quiet. It was already late afternoon when we arrived at the cabin, and the shadows of the forest were spreading farther across the ground. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, small and rustic, with towering trees surrounding it. There was a small porch with a few old rocking chairs, and the windows were covered in thin white curtains that fluttered in the breeze. However, as soon as we got out of the car, I felt a chill go down my spine because the air was so quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath. There were no birds chirping or leaves rustling, just a creepy silence. Sarah, who was usually the watchful one in our group, mumbled as she picked up her luggage, and I could sense the uneasiness in her eyes. After all, it's just a cabin. Mike laughed, slapping her on the back. You're letting your imagination get the best of you. We unloaded our bags and headed inside. The cabin was simple: a small living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. It smelled like wood and dust, like it hadn't been used in a long time. That first night we sat around the fireplace talking and laughing like we always did, but as the hours passed and the fire died down, the mood began to shift. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, and the silence outside became more oppressive. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. But then late at night I heard something. It started as a soft creaking sound like footsteps on old wood. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, trying to listen. The cabin was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. The creaking grew louder, closer. It was coming from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear, afraid to move. Then the doorknob slowly turned. I froze, watching as the door inched open. A sliver of the room was filled with moonlight, lighting the entrance. Mike was a towering, gloomy, motionless figure who I could just make out standing there. I trembled and whispered, but the figure remained still and motionless, as if it were observing me. My body would not move, even though I wanted to scream to get out of that bed and go. Then, as abruptly as it had been, the figure retreated and vanished into the night. The door creaked shut, and I was left alone in the silent room, shaking with fear. The next morning I told the others what happened, but they brushed it off. Mike said it was probably just a dream, and Sarah suggested it could have been the wind, but I knew what I saw. That figure was real. The second night was worse. We were all on edge. The cheerful atmosphere from the first day long gone. Every little noise seemed amplified in the stillness of the cabin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Around midnight the creaking started again. This time it was louder, echoing through the cabin like something heavy was moving across the floor. We all heard it. Mike grabbed a flashlight and led the way down the hallway, his hand shaking as he pointed the beam of light ahead. The creaking stopped just outside the living room. We stood there staring at the empty space, our hearts pounding in our chests. There was no one there, but the air felt thick with tension, like we weren't alone. Suddenly the rocking chair on the porch began to move, creaking back and forth slowly. We all jumped, staring at the door that led outside. The chair rocked on its own even though there was no wind. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us had an answer that night. None of us slept. We huddled together in the living room, keeping the flashlight on and the fire burning. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside sent us into a panic. We were all thinking the same thing. We needed to leave, but it was too dark to risk driving through the forest at night. The next morning, as soon as the sun rose, we packed our things and left the cabin. The drive back felt endless, the trees closing in around us as if the forest didn't want to let us go. When we finally made it back to civilization, none of us spoke about what happened. We were just happy to be out of that place, but the memory of that cabin, of the figure in the doorway, and the rocking chair that moved on its own still haunts me. All I know is that we will never return to that cabin again, but I have no idea what we experienced in those woods, and I don't want to know. Mark is my name. It all began when my friends and I decided to rent a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing time to catch up and take a break from our busy lives. I'm 28 years old, and until a year ago, I didn't believe in anything paranormal, ghosts, curses, haunted places, or anything like that. However, after what happened in that cabin, I've changed. I don't tell people about this much because most people wouldn't believe me, but I feel compelled to share it, even if it's just to get it off my chest. Greg, since college, Emma and Tom had been friends, but as time passed, our friendship waned. This vacation was intended to reunite us. Greg discovered the cabin online. It seemed to be a comfortable little spot tucked away in the woods with a porch and a fire pit, and there was not a neighbor in sight. The price was far less than we anticipated, which at the time seemed like a benefit, but now I see that it should have been a caution. The ad talked about the serene setting and the breathtaking views of the surrounding forest. We loaded our luggage, food, and enough alcohol for the weekend into my old SUV and set off early on a Friday morning. The journey took around 5 hours, and as we approached the cabin, the scenery changed. The trees' branches thickened and they became higher, and the sunlight appeared to fight to reach the canopy above us. The road shrunk to one lane, and there were no homes, automobiles, or indications of life. Nothing. It was late afternoon when we got there, and the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was small, rusted, had a sloped roof, and a small porch, but I couldn't get rid of the eerie feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and there was a strange silence around us. No birds, no rustling leaves. Is this setting a touch eerie, or is it just me? Emma inquired, her voice scarcely audible above a whisper, as she got out of the vehicle. Greg tried to lighten the situation by laughing, and it worked well. The cabin was simple, with a large room, a small kitchen, a living area with an old couch and a fireplace, and 2 bedrooms in the back. It smelled like wood and dust, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. The furniture was sturdy but old, and there were a few paintings of forests and mountains on the walls. We're in the middle of nowhere, with no noise, no stress, just peace and quiet. I nodded, but the unease in my stomach wouldn't go away. The sun was beginning to set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground, but we didn't mind as we walked. The silence was eerie, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. We decided to explore the area after we settled in. There was a small trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods, and we thought it would be a good way to stretch our legs after the long drive. Tom asked in a strained voice. Greg and I cracked open a few beers while Emma prepared dinner, and for a short while it felt like things were back to normal as we laughed, joked, and reminisced about our college days. However, as the evening wore on, the atmosphere changed as the fire crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering lights. Greg laughed, but there was an edge to it. It's just the woods, man. They can play tricks on you. Tom wasn't convinced, so I'm serious. After that, we all fell silent, scanning the trees as we continued down the trail, and the more intense the feeling became. The cabin seemed to be groaning and shifting beneath an unseen weight as the wind outside started howling and shaking the windows, and shortly after midnight, we heard. At first, the faint scratching sound coming from the rear door seemed like something rubbing against the wood, and we all stopped, staring at the door. What the devil was Emma whispering, her face becoming pale. Greg is always the courageous. We all held our breath expecting for him to say anything, but he simply stood there peering into the night after getting up and grabbing a flashlight, possibly from a tree or something else, and gently opening the door to shine it into the darkness. I said, my voice scarcely audible, "What do you see?" "There's nothing out there," Greg said, his voice shaky, "but I swear I thought I saw something moving." We all exchanged uncomfortable looks, and the tension in the room became unbearable. Greg didn't respond. He just stood there, the beam of light trembling in his hand. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he slowly backed away from the door and shut it. There was a problem. That night, someone was watching us, and none of us slept well. Every sound, even creaks and wind gusts, made my pulse race. The following day, we tried to get rid of the fear by spending the morning fishing by the lake in the hopes that being outside in the daylight would help us relax, but it never really went away. I kept seeing the tree line, half expecting to see something hiding in the shadows. I kept seeing something creeping through the woods, getting closer to the cabin, waiting for the right moment to strike. The sky had already darkened by the time we returned to the cabin, and as we got to the front porch, I noticed something odd. The ground around the cabin appeared disturbed, as if someone or something had been walking around its perimeter. The dirt was scuffed, and there were odd marks that resembled claw prints but were too big to be any animal I could think of. "Did you guys notice this?" I called out, pointing to the ground, and Emma and Tom came over. Their faces were filled with confusion, and Tom's voice was shaky. Greg's forehead was wrinkled in contemplation. That night was even worse than the first. The wind howled louder and the scratching at the back door returned, making it seem like whatever was out there was trying to get in. We all huddled together in the living room, and every light in the cabin turned on as if that would somehow keep us safe. No one wanted to check the door again because we were too afraid to move, and just after midnight, the scratching stopped for a moment. I don't know, maybe it was A.B. Bear, but I didn't think the prince was too strange or planned. We all exhaled in relief when there was a pause, but it was brief because then there was a loud bang that shook the cabin and made the walls tremble. It sounded like something had struck the side of the house with such force that we all leaped to our feet, our eyes wide with fear. What the hell was Emma crying? "Emma? We shouldn't remain here, I suppose," I said, my pulse thumping in my chest. Greg nodded, his face pale, and we decided it was time to leave. We gathered our belongings as fast as we could, not caring to pack neatly or to leave anything behind. And as we hurried out the front door and into the car, I took one last look back at the cabin and saw a dark figure standing just beyond the tree line. Its eyes were glowing faintly in the darkness, and it was too tall to be human, and its shape was wrong, twisted, and unnatural. The others had also seen it, so I didn't say anything. They had already. We drove down the narrow dirt road, never looking back, and didn't stop until we were miles away. We never discussed what had happened, and we simply decided that whatever was in that forest or watching us from the shadows, I never wanted to see it again. The hut at the edge of the forest is a location I will always remember, but I will never go back there, and I really hope you never do either. When I was a kid, my grandparents had a cabin, and they would let my parents as well as aunts and uncles use it all the time. It was about an hour away from our house, and it was always fun to go up there. The cabin itself was pretty big, however there was no electricity or plumbing, so as a kid that always bothered me. My family went up there for a weekend once when I was 10. I remember that we had a pretty big amount of land with the cabin itself, and I am not even sure if there were any other cabins nearby at all. My family is kind of big. I am the youngest, and I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and then both of my parents were there as well. When we got to the cabin, we started playing games outside and that kind of stuff. My dad brought some burgers and hot dogs to grill, and after dinner we had a campfire and sat around it having a s'more. At one point I really had to go to the bathroom, which unfortunately we had to use the woods, for I had gone earlier in the day, but now it was nighttime. I was sort of scared to go into the woods by myself, but I was also shy going to the bathroom near other people when I was that age, so I didn't want to just duck behind a tree. I walked out down a path that led into the woods, and when I could no longer hear the talking of my siblings, I felt comfortable enough. I took a few steps into the woods, and when afterwards I walked back to the path and immediately heard noises of brush and leaves moving from about 20 feet away on the other side of the path in the woods. I thought it was possibly an animal like a deer because it sounded big. I started to run back on the trail, but I heard whatever it was moving towards me, as well as if it was trying to pass me. I stopped and froze in my place. I thought whatever animal was there would cross the path ahead of me, but instead it stopped just short of the path. I watched the area where I had heard the noise intently. Then I noticed what appeared to be a person hiding behind a tree. All I saw was the face, but it looked like some guy watching me from behind a tree in our woods. The way he seemed to be looking at me really freaked me out, like he was insane or something. I sprinted all the way back without looking. I got back to. I told my parents that I had seen a guy in the woods, but they didn't seem to believe me at first because I was the youngest child. All I remember is my dad telling me that the property my grandparents owned was very big, and there was very little chance that anyone else would be out there. To cheer me up, he went back to the spot on the trail where I had seen the guy, but by this time, he was gone, and we didn't hear anything, so we went back, and I felt better now that I was with everyone and not alone in the woods any longer. I had a few s'mores by the fire, and then we all went inside the cabin to bed. There were a few bedrooms with bunk beds, so everyone had a place to sleep without TV or video games. And since this was before most smartphones, we all essentially just got ready for bed. I remember that I was walking to the bedroom that I was staying in when I heard my older brother Tony come inside and say that he saw a creepy guy standing outside the cabin. Everybody gathered around to the front window that looked outside the cabin to the front yard, and there he was. The same guy who I had seen in the woods was now standing in our front yard. He looked just as creepy As the first time I had seen him, he was wearing a dark-colored sweatshirt and what looked to be baggy and ripped jeans. The guy was just standing there facing our house. My dad said that he was going to go out and talk to the guy. He walked out the front door and I heard him call out to the man asking who he was and how he could help him. But almost right after my dad started to speak, the guy started running straight for him. My dad went back inside quickly and locked the door. The guy tried opening it and then started banging on the door. My dad luckily did have a cell phone back then and was able to get a signal. He used it to call the police. The guy kept banging at the door and after a while finally stopped and seemed to go off somewhere. It took a while for the police to arrive way out there, but they eventually did get there and searched the property and found the man hiding in the woods.